Stop talking! The phrase echoed in the room like a gavel slammed in anger, sharp and commanding, not to be ignored. For a moment all was stopped, the hum of voices, the shuffling of papers, even the restless movements of the crowd. All were pinned in that sudden, electric silence. Heads turned as one, eyes snapped toward the source of the explosion. Pam Bondi remained upright, her voice still echoing in the stunned environment, the weight of her directive hanging between the walls. It was the kind of moment that does not simply happen. It bursts, a burst of raw hostility. Bereft of its guise, intended not to stop but to seize, to stifle, and the room sensed it. There was no mistaking the tipping of authority she was trying to usurp in those two words. It was stronger than a command. It was a threat, an attempt to shut down something larger than speech, to shut down presence itself. But across from her, seated with deliberate composure, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands rested gently on the desk before her. Her eyes held steady, unblinking, as if she had been expecting this very eruption all along, where Bondi's words were jagged and cutting. Crockett's silence was smooth, impenetrable, almost defiant in its calm. The clash was immediate, one voice erupting in fury, the other answering with quiet stillness. The air thickened, witnesses in the back row leaned forward, cameras closed in, lenses drinking in every micro-expression. Mouths fell open with shock. Others curled lips into knowing smirks, as if they too had had enough of watching scenes like this play out. The same voices screaming, the same attempting to shut off those who would not be quieted. Bondi's command might have been meant to end the conversation, but instead it only magnified the stage. What would happen next was no longer just about two figures in a room. It became a test of poise versus volume, dignity versus dominance. Every second stretched, every heartbeat louder, as Crockett prepared to respond. The anticipation wasn't about if she would answer, but how. Because everyone knew in their bones this wasn't over, far from it. And what followed those two words would ring out far beyond the walls of the chamber, spilling outward until millions saw it themselves with their own eyes. But to understand why this moment unsettled millions, we must turn back. Moments of raw confrontation inside political chambers are nothing new. History is littered with shouts, interruptions, and fiery exchanges meant to dominate the spotlight. But this clash between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett unfolded in a climate charged with far more than parliamentary procedure. It was a reflection of an America already brimming with tension, where questions of voice, belonging, and dignity play out daily, both on the floor of government and in the lives of ordinary people. The eruption of those words, "Stop talking," wasn't an isolated outburst. It struck a nerve because it echoed something larger. The enduring attempt to silence those who refuse to bow, especially when those voices come from women of color, daring to hold their ground. Across the country, debates about representation have never been louder. For decades, the political arena was dominated by familiar faces and familiar tones. Louder, sharper, overwhelmingly homogeneous. But new voices have entered the stage. Voices that carry the weight of communities too long ignored. Voices that carry stories of resilience. Stories rooted in cultures and struggles often dismissed. And with every gain comes resistance. It's no coincidence that the attempts to cut off, to drown out, to delegitimize, often land hardest on those women who symbolize that very change. That is why the moment between Bondi and Crockett mattered. To some, it may have seemed like just another heated exchange, another skirmish in a room already prone to theatrics. But for those watching closely, it was a microcosm of something larger. The collision between the old politics of dominance and the rising politics of presence. It wasn't merely a shout across a chamber. It was an attempt to reassert control in a landscape shifting away from those who once held it without question. Consider the millions who watched the clip later, their reactions spilling across timelines. They didn't just see one woman shouting and another sitting in silence. They saw echoes of their own experiences. Being talked over in classrooms, interrupted in workplaces, dismissed in conversations where their voices deserved equal weight. Crockett's calm was not just composure. It was recognition. She embodied the strength to resist the demand to shrink, to fold, to yield. And that is why the suspense grew so thick in that instant. People knew intuitively, this wasn't just another shouting match. This was something else entirely. A line had been crossed, and the balance of power in the room was shifting. The audience could feel it, the way a storm brews before it breaks. They leaned in, waiting not for noise, but for revelation. The cultural context gave this confrontation its electricity. It wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was unfolding at a moment when more Americans than ever are asking whose voices get heard and whose voices get silenced. The clash became a symbol, a test of whether dignity could triumph over aggression in a society still grappling with those very questions. What happened next would leave a permanent mark on political discourse, not because of the volume of Bondi's command, but because of the composure with which it was answered. It was the composure that turned a shout into a spectacle and a spectacle into a lesson. To see why Bondi's words backfired so spectacularly, you need to know her playbook. Pam Bondi did not arrive in that chamber as an unknown figure. Long before the viral clip, her career had been built on the theatrics of confrontation. She rose through the ranks as a prosecutor in Florida, carving out a reputation not only for her sharp tongue but for a brand of legal swagger that played well in front of cameras. In court, she was the kind of attorney who treated cross-examination like a sport, louder, harder, never relenting until her opponent was flustered. To her supporters, that made her tough to her critics. It made her a bully. Her ascent to statewide office was paved by that very image, the combative, no-nonsense fighter who seemed to relish the spectacle of conflict. As Florida's Attorney General, she frequently stepped in front of microphones with a confident tilt of the chin, her tone suggesting not just certainty but superiority. The press conferences were never just about the law. They were about Bondi herself, about her ability to project command and to appear unshaken, no matter how shaky the details might be beneath the surface. And controversies followed. She was accused of playing partisan games, of choosing her battles not solely on principle, but on political expedience. Headlines trailed her about decisions that raised eyebrows, such as the moment she delayed action on consumer fraud cases, while donations conveniently flowed into her political accounts. For many, it seemed less like the impartial pursuit of justice, and more like the calculating maneuvers of someone who knew power was not simply wielded, it was leveraged. The courtroom had given her an arena, but politics had given her a stage, and she performed with an edge that always bordered on smug. When she later transitioned into television commentary, Bondi carried that same air of superiority with her. On screen, she was sharp and unyielding, dissecting opponents with a practiced sneer, quick to cut them off, quick to dominate the conversation. Viewers who aligned with her ideology cheered her confidence, while others saw the same pattern repeated, the tactic of interruption, the force of volume, the assumption that if she spoke loudly enough, no one else could speak at all. It was the old courtroom bully trick, transported into the national spotlight. Raise your voice, cut them down, don't let them finish. Theatrics as strategy, and that strategy, again and again, revealed itself in moments where her opponents were often women or people she perceived as easier to corner. The interruptions were not random. They were targeted. They reflected a style that treated disagreement not as debate, but as domination. Every exchange was a contest to be won, not by the weight of the argument, but by the sheer force of personality. She reveled in the role, certain that the louder she roared, the more she would be remembered. But if the courtroom had rewarded that behavior, and television had amplified it, the broader public was beginning to tire of it. In an age where more Americans were tuned in to the dynamics of power, who gets silenced, who gets heard, the old tricks didn't land with the same effectiveness. What once read as toughness now often read as arrogance. What once seemed like command now came across as insecurity, disguised as volume that day in the chamber, when she unleashed her booming "stop talking." It was not a departure from her style. It was the culmination of it. The raised voice, the public attempt to silence, the smug certainty that this tactic would once again grant her the upper hand. She had used it countless times before, in courts, in interviews, on television panels. But in this moment, against this opponent, the formula was destined to fail. What had worked as intimidation would instead expose the very fragility behind the performance. The chamber felt the weight of her reputation in that instant. To some, it was the same old Bondi, relentless, theatrical, smug in her certainty. To others, it was a flashback to every time they had seen someone try to shout down a challenger rather than engage them, and to millions watching later, the impression was unmistakable. Bondi was not simply expressing anger. She was attempting to enforce silence. She was not asking for order. She was demanding submission. That is why the eruption struck such a chord. It wasn't just the words, it was the years of practice behind them. The history of a persona built on silencing, condensed into 2 syllables: stop. For a brief moment, she believed she could once again seize control, that the volume of her command would drown out anything that followed. But what came next would dismantle that illusion. Because standing across from Bondi that day was someone forged by struggle and resilience. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the marble halls of power or beneath the glare of television cameras. It begins far away from the pomp and spotlight, in the rhythms of everyday life that shaped her understanding of grit, dignity, and the weight of being underestimated. Growing up, she knew what it meant to face challenges without shortcuts, to watch family and community persevere with little more than determination and belief in their worth. Those roots taught her that silence is not an option when injustice thrives, and that dignity must be defended even when no one else seems willing to stand beside you. From an early age, she found herself gravitating toward advocacy, instinctively drawn to defend those overlooked or dismissed. The courtroom, when she finally entered it, was never about theatrics for her. It was about service. She did not crave the spotlight for herself. She craved fairness for others. Clients without power, without money, without a voice. Those were the people she fought for. And in every case, she learned the value of steady composure. Anger might flare, voices might rise, but true strength was often revealed in how one could hold the line without flinching. Even as the storm raged around them, that skill, refined in countless battles as a lawyer, prepared her for the bigger stage she would eventually step onto. Politics was never a childhood dream. It was a reluctant call, one she answered, because she saw how often communities like hers were treated as afterthoughts. When she ran for office, it wasn't with the bankroll of the powerful, but with the fire of conviction and the belief that people deserved a champion who spoke their language, felt their struggles, and refused to be silenced. Against the odds, she won, and with that victory, a new kind of voice entered the chamber. One unpolished by privilege, sharpened instead by experience. As a congresswoman, Crockett quickly became known for her fierce but measured defenses. She had a talent for cutting through noise without sacrificing composure, for standing her ground when others attempted to drown her out. When attacked, she did not shrink back. She leaned forward, calm yet unyielding, letting her arguments dismantle opponents piece by piece. Observers began to notice a pattern. No matter how heated the exchange, she never lost her poise. The angrier her adversaries grew, the steadier she seemed to become. It was a style born from years of practice, but also from a deeper understanding that those watching from the outside needed to see dignity modeled in real time. And people did watch. They didn't just see a politician, they saw themselves reflected. For countless viewers, particularly those accustomed to being spoken over or brushed aside. Crockett's calm replies were more than words in a chamber. They were affirmations. Each time she refused to be cowed, she gave silent permission for others to claim their own voices. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every viewer tired of being silenced, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in the conversation. This is what made her the perfect counterweight to Pam Bondi. Where Bondi thrived on volume and intimidation, Crockett embodied stillness and resolve. Where Bondi sharpened her reputation on the art of cutting people off, Crockett honed hers on the discipline of never letting arrogance dictate her response. In many ways, the two women could not have been more different, and it was that contrast that gave the confrontation its cinematic quality. Bondi represented the politics of silencing, Crockett represented the politics of endurance. When the two finally collided, it was more than personalities clashing. It was legacies, histories, and archetypes facing off. The bully versus the steady defender. The command to stop talking versus the unspoken power of refusing to disappear. In that instant, Crockett carried not only her own composure, but the weight of everyone watching, waiting, hoping that arrogance would not have the final word. Her calm reply would not be born from happenstance. It was the product of everything she had lived through. The courtroom lessons, the political uphill battles, the countless moments of being underestimated. It was forged in resilience, tempered by humility, and delivered with the authority of someone who knew silence could no longer be tolerated. That is why, when Bondi's shout erupted, the room seemed to lean toward Crockett instinctively. People anticipated not an outburst in return, but a demonstration of something stronger, the kind of strength that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And so, when Bondi tried to shut her down, Crockett did what no one expected. The chamber snapped back into motion. The silence shattered as Bondi pressed forward with her familiar tactic. She leaned across the table, her voice sharp and rising, her words overlapping Crockett's every attempt to speak. Each interruption came quicker than the last, punctuated with dismissive gestures meant to slice through the air like weapons. The room felt smaller with every outburst, the sheer force of her voice trying to box her opponent into a corner where words could not breathe. Spectators shifted uneasily in their seats. Staffers darted glances at one another, some incredulous, others already pulling out their phones to capture the spectacle they knew would spill far beyond these walls. Bondi's cheeks flushed crimson, her hands tightening into emphatic motions, stabbing the air for emphasis. She was not asking to be heard. She was demanding it, crowding the space with volume until she believed there would be no room left for anyone else. But Jasmine Crockett sat steady. Her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed, her voice deliberately quiet as she attempted to respond, only to be cut off again and again. The interruptions piled up, yet she did not rush, did not scramble to compete with the roar. Instead, she waited. The contrast was glaring, Bondi straining harder, growing louder, and Crockett anchored in composure, her calm presence amplifying the frenzy across from her. Those watching could feel the tension coil tighter. It was no longer just a clash of words. It was a battle of styles, of temperaments, of philosophies. Bondi wielded interruption as her weapon, hoping the barrage itself would carry the victory. Crockett, by refusing to mirror the frenzy, turned her stillness into a mirror of its own, reflecting Bondi's desperation back at her. Each second she held steady, the imbalance became clearer, and the room seemed to recognize it. Bondi raised her voice again, her volume climbing like a siren, words colliding on top of one another, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed, her impatience obvious. The longer Crockett stayed unflustered, the more Bondi seemed determined to shatter that calm, as if sheer decibels could dismantle dignity. But dignity does not yield to noise. Crockett's silence was louder than Bondi's interruptions, and the crowd felt it. Some leaned forward in anticipation, sensing the inevitable break in the rhythm. Others shook their heads, already murmuring under their breath about the imbalance on display. The room itself seemed to pulse with suspense, the back, and forth less about the substance of argument than about the endurance of one against the frenzy of the other. Bondi's volume climbed higher. The crowd leaned forward. Then Crockett opened her mouth. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Bondi's voice still reverberated in the chamber, her final interruption hanging jagged and raw in the air. All eyes shifted back to Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see if she would finally crack, if she would match volume with volume, fury with fury. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly forward, her posture composed, her gaze steady. She let the silence linger, stretching just long enough to make the weight of her calm undeniable. The pause itself became an answer, a refusal to be rattled. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Not weak, not timid, quiet with intention, the kind of quiet that forces people to lean in. "You can yell all you want," she said. "Each word deliberate, each syllable steady, but you don't get to decide when my voice ends." The room reacted instantly. A ripple of gasps, subtle but unmistakable, moved across the chamber. A staffer in the back froze mid-step. Someone else let out a barely contained the kind of sound born from recognition. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, yet the words sliced cleaner than any shout could. Bondi blinked, her flush deepening. She shifted in her chair, lips parting as if to fire back. But the rhythm was broken. The command she had tried to impose no longer carried its intended sting. The air had shifted, The center of gravity belonged to Crockett now. Crockett continued, her voice unshaken. "We've all seen this tactic before," she said, gesturing lightly with an open hand. Her tone equal parts explanation and indictment. "Talk over, shout down, drown out. It's meant to silence, not to debate, not to understand. But here's the thing. When you try to silence someone, you only prove how much you fear what they have to say." Another stir of reaction rippled through the crowd. A few heads nodded. Phones rose a little higher, recording every word. For those in the chamber, it felt less like a reply and more like a revelation unfolding in real time. Bondi interjected again, her voice a touch louder, but it cracked on the edge of her words. Crockett didn't flinch. She simply waited, the silence swallowing Bondi's attempt, before continuing on her own terms. "Volume isn't power," she said, calm as ever. "Dignity is." The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in audible gasps, scattered applause, murmurs of disbelief at the sharpness of the line. It was as if Crockett had taken Bondi's tactic and inverted it, turning the command to stop talking into an opportunity to underscore the futility of trying to erase her voice. Bondi sat straighter, her eyes flashing, her hands tightening on the table before her. But with each attempt to reassert herself, it was clear the momentum had shifted beyond her control. Her interruptions no longer landed with authority. They felt hollow, even desperate. The more she pressed, the more Crockett's composure grew luminous by comparison. And then came the moment that sealed it. Crockett leaned back, her tone almost conversational, her delivery razor sharp in its restraint. "You wanted me silent," she said. "But silence doesn't serve the people who sent me here, and it doesn't serve this country. My voice isn't mine alone. It belongs to those who've been told to sit down, to stop speaking, to disappear. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't my voice. Maybe it's your fear of hearing it." The chamber broke. Applause rang out, scattered at first, then swelling as more joined in. A burst of claps, a chorus of agreement, the sound of approval rising in defiance of the demand for silence. Even those who remained still couldn't mask the looks of astonishment on their faces. In that moment, it was undeniable. The balance of power had flipped. Bondi's eyes darted from side to side, her jaw set tight. She opened her mouth again, but the volume that once commanded attention now seemed strained, her words tripping over themselves. Crockett didn't need to respond. She had already delivered the blow that would echo far beyond the chamber. The audience could sense it. The viral clip was already writing itself. The drama unfolded in slow motion. Bondi flushed and agitated, struggling to regain her footing. Crockett, calm and unyielding, embodying the poise that made every interruption look smaller, weaker, more desperate. Cameras zoomed closer, pens scribbled faster. The energy in the room was no longer about Bondi's command. It was about Crockett's reply. The kind of reply destined to outlast the moment, to travel across screens, to be replayed, shared, celebrated, and then, with one final glance toward her opponent, Crockett delivered the closing line that turned the confrontation into legend. "You can try to shout me down today," she said, her voice firm yet composed. "But tomorrow, the only thing people will remember is who stood tall when it mattered." The applause returned, louder this time, swelling into cheers in some corners. A wave of disbelief mixed with admiration rolled through the chamber. Bondi's command, once meant to silence, had backfired spectacularly. What was supposed to end a voice had instead amplified it to the world. Pam Bondi's confidence crumbled visibly, her lips tightening, her notes clutched more fiercely in her hands. Each interruption she attempted from then on felt like an echo stripped of authority, diminished by the weight of Crockett's composure. By the time the exchange concluded, it was no longer just an argument. It was a performance of power undone, a moment where arrogance had been met not with equal fury, but with unshakable dignity. The chamber would not forget. Neither would the cameras. But if the room was stunned, the internet's reaction would be something else entirely. The moment the words left Jasmine Crockett's mouth, the chamber erupted in applause. But outside those walls, something far bigger was already beginning. Within minutes, the clip had been clipped, captioned, and launched onto every major platform. Twitter feeds lit up first. the video spreading with the velocity of lightning in a summer storm. The phrase, "Volume isn't power, dignity is," was typed, retweeted, and screen grabbed thousands of times. Each repetition layering another strand into a rapidly growing web of outrage, admiration, and disbelief. By the first hour, hashtags began to climb. Number Calm Crush trended alongside Number Stop Talking Fail, each one carrying its own collection of memes, GIFs, and subtitled loops of the exact moment when Bondi's expression faltered and Crockett's composure shone. One viral meme placed Bondi's command in bold letters, "Stop talking," followed by a freeze frame of Crockett's poised reply beneath the caption, "This is what standing tall looks like." Another loop slowed down Crockett's delivery, overlaying it with triumphant music, turning the confrontation into a cinematic trailer for dignity itself. Celebrities quickly joined the chorus. A well-known actor tweeted, "I've never cheered so hard for silence to be broken with such class." While a best-selling author wrote, "This isn't just politics, this is a masterclass in composure." Pundits who usually clashed across the airwaves found themselves united in one observation. Bondi had overplayed her hand, and Crockett had turned restraint into a weapon sharper than any raised voice. Everyday Americans poured in with their own reflections. Comments flooded under the clip on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, many of them intensely personal. A teacher wrote, "I felt like she was speaking for me for every time I've been cut off in a meeting." A young college student said, "She didn't just respond. She showed us how to win without shouting." Another user summed it up bluntly. "She said what millions wished they could say in that moment." The digital tide was unmistakable. On YouTube, commentators broke down the exchange frame by frame, pointing out the precise second when Bondi's voice cracked, when Crockett's calm shifted the energy in the room. On Instagram, stylized quote cards featuring Crockett's lines began circulating like modern-day posters, affirmations for a generation accustomed to watching their leaders through the prism of viral moments. Even late night comedians took notice. Monologues opened with reenactments of the shout, "Stop talking," followed by mock silence. And then the calm comeback that drew laughs and applause from studio audiences. Bondi had become the punchline, her outburst frozen in digital eternity, while Crockett was elevated to the role of accidental icon. The speed of it all was dizzying. Within 24 hours, Crockett's name had been mentioned in tens of thousands of posts, her calm response replayed across morning shows, podcasts, and primetime news. She hadn't just answered a shout, she had authored a cultural moment, one destined to be replayed whenever arrogance met dignity in the public square. And for Bondi, the fallout was just as swift. Comment sections filled with derision, mocking her as the courtroom bully talked by composure. Screenshots of her flushed face mid-shout became memes in themselves, paired with captions like "louder doesn't mean stronger," and "the look when you realize volume can't save you." In the theater of digital culture, Bondi's attempt at dominance had been rewritten as a cautionary tale. What made it resonate wasn't just the spectacle, but the symbolism. People weren't sharing the clip because it was entertaining. They were sharing it because it felt familiar in workplaces, classrooms, family dinners. So many had been told to quiet down, to wait their turn, to disappear. Crockett's reply became their reply, her voice carrying the frustration and the validation of millions who rarely saw their own experience reflected on such a visible stage. The narrative was no longer just Bondi versus Crockett. It was arrogance versus dignity, silencing versus speaking up, the old guard versus the rising tide. Digital culture thrives on polarity, and here it was handed a story with two perfect archetypes: the aggressor undone by her own tactics, and the composed challenger who rose above it. For days, the clip remained pinned to the top of feeds, commentary multiplying in layers, political analysis, cultural reflection, even personal testimonies of viewers describing the goosebumps they felt watching Crockett hold her ground. The viral spread was relentless, proof of how deeply the moment had struck. And yet, beyond the viral fame, there was something deeper, a moral that lingered long after the tweets faded. When the echoes of applause finally quieted and the flurry of headlines began to settle, what remained was not just the image of one woman shouting and another holding steady. What lingered was the lesson embedded within that exchange, a reminder that dignity has a power louder than any raised voice. Jasmine Crockett's reply was never about trading barbs, never about matching insult with insult. It was about reframing the attack itself, transforming an act of attempted silencing into a testament to endurance, grace, and the resilience of service over arrogance. In that moment, Crockett modeled something rare in politics: the ability to rise above hostility without abandoning conviction. She showed that strength is not measured in decibels but in composure, that credibility does not come from intimidation but from integrity. Her calm reply turned the tables not just on her opponent, but on the very assumption that dominance belongs to those who shout the loudest. For millions watching, the scene resonated far beyond the chamber. It spoke to every person who has ever been interrupted mid-sentence, every worker dismissed in a meeting, every student told their question wasn't worth hearing, every neighbor told they didn't belong. Crockett's words became more than political rhetoric. They became a mirror in which people saw their own struggles and their own defiance reflected. Her stand in that room validated experiences too often brushed aside, saying without apology, your voice matters, your presence matters, your dignity cannot be taken from you. The power of her reply lay not only in what she said, but in what she represented. Service stood across from hostility, integrity across from arrogance. It was not a clash of equals, but a demonstration that the values of patience, restraint, and truth will always outlast the noise of intimidation. Crockett embodied the idea that public office is not a stage for personal theatrics, but a responsibility to those unheard voices who look to their leaders for representation and respect. And this is where the story deepened into something universal, because while the confrontation happened in one chamber on one particular day, its meaning transcended politics. It became a lesson in everyday courage, in workplaces and schools, in families and communities. The temptation to shout down in silence will always exist. But Crockett's response reminded everyone that the true victory lies in refusing to let hostility define the terms of engagement. Dignity, she showed, is not weakness. It is the greatest form of strength. As the applause echoed and the viral clips multiplied, a new kind of energy spread, not just outrage, but inspiration. People didn't simply share the video because it entertained them. They shared it because it called something out of them. A recognition that they too could hold steady in the face of arrogance, that they too could refuse to be diminished by someone else's attempt to silence. Crockett's moment was not about winning a debate point. It was about reframing the entire encounter into a universal truth. When arrogance demands silence, dignity answers with presence. When hostility seeks to overwhelm, service seeks to uplift. And when voices are told to stop, the most powerful answer is not retreat, but resolve. That is why the memory of her words will outlast the viral cycle. They weren't just a clapback, weren't just a soundbite destined for memes. They were a moral reminder that belongs to everyone who has ever needed courage in the face of dismissal. And that's why this wasn't just a clapback, it was a call to action. The moment began with a shout meant to end the conversation, "Stop talking." But it ended with a calm reply that traveled across the nation. What was meant to silence instead ignited. What was meant to dominate instead collapsed. And what was meant to diminish instead elevated. Jasmine Crockett's steady words became the centerpiece of a viral moment that reminded millions why composure in the face of hostility is not weakness but power. This is why the clip struck such a nerve. It wasn't just the spectacle of one voice clashing against another. It was the clarity of seeing arrogance undone by dignity. In an age overflowing with noise, people recognized something rare, a leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. And the moral was undeniable. Silence the hate, not the truth. That lesson belongs not only to Crockett, but to all who saw themselves in her resolve. Every share, every repost, every comment was more than digital chatter. It was participation in something larger, a collective affirmation that dignity will not be erased by volume. That is the movement taking shape. A movement that grows every time someone refuses to bow to intimidation. Every time someone decides their voice deserves to stay in the conversation. So if you felt that surge of recognition watching her reply, if you too are tired of voices being shut down, then add your own. Subscribe, share, and stand with us in carrying forward this message. The more it spreads, the harder it becomes to silence. Because sometimes, the calmest voices leave the loudest echoes,